Hello. So we're going to be looking at chapter 3 from Maurizio's text. The second edition here does differ quite a bit from the first edition. The first edition of the first two chapters is pretty much the same or pretty close to the same. But in the third, the Greek reading is different. We have a selection from the Works and Days instead of a selection from the play, the tragedy Prometheus Bound. So that is different. All right. Quickly, the history section is going to look at Zeus and Hera. Mainly going to look at Zeus. And of course, with Zeus, you've got the idea of order. But of course, those who rebel against that, they have to be dealt with. The theory is going to argue, the theory in this chapter is going to argue the opposite of Malinowski's, which is that myths have to be studied only in their particular social context. So in other words, the Trobriand myths work for the Trobriand Islanders. They do not work for anyone else. They do not have that sort of power or influence. And this really won't counter that part that each culture has its own special sort of connection to stories, but that there are universal questions that myths can in fact address, and in fact are the main questions that do get asked in myth. Why are we here? What happens after we die? That sort of thing. Those are questions that pretty much every culture has asked. For the comparison, we're gonna look at the flood story. The flood story here doesn't directly connect to the Hesiod Works and Days, but the Works and Days does deal with the idea of there being punishment for humans being bad or the earth being beyond fixing. There is a flood narrative, but it came about quite later. Hesiod doesn't know that story, so in his version, there are the 5 ages of man, 5 ages of humankind. And then the reception or the Nachleben section is going to look at 2 poems dealing with the story of Leda and the Swan. So one of the things that happens at the end of the Theogony is that we have a list of Zeus's wives and the kids from that. Partly, of course, this establishes Zeus as really the father of heroes. There are other heroes. I mean, Theseus, for instance, his dad is Poseidon. There are other gods. Achilles, doesn't have an immortal dad. He has an immortal goddess mother. But Zeus has a lot of kids and has a lot of mortal kids who, of course, of their very nature, are going to be heroes. Zeus represents, among other things, the cosmic order, right? And as such, he wields the weapons of thunder and lightning to sort of enforce that order. The name Zeus seems to be connected to the Indo-European word that means bright, and he may very well represent the bright sky, the sunny sky, which of course is what you like, right? I mean, rain is necessary, storms are necessary, but it's always nice to be out on a sunny day. He commands thunder and lightning, rains and storms, and for the Romans, remember, Jupiter is just that. He is just the storms, not so much a guy controlling storms, but actually the storms themselves. There was a sense that Zeus dwelled on mountains. For one thing, Zeus seems to know more than others, and mountains give you a sky view, and therefore you can see more, bird's eye view of things, and you can see more, and that would make sense for a god who knows more. Cult and ritual. Ritual is the actual practice. Myths tell stories, but ritual is the actual practice. The Mass in the Catholic Church is a ritual, for instance. Cult refers to a particular worship. So there is a cult of Demeter at Eleusis, the Eleusinian Mysteries. There are cults of Demeter elsewhere, but that particular cult, right, the Eleusinian cult, worship is there at Eleusis, a city near Athens. So here is a Roman copy of a Greek statue, probably a much bigger statue of Zeus. So this is not an uncommon thing. Zeus is seated on a throne. Maybe Zeus is holding a lightning bolt. We can't tell because both arms have been broken off. You know, of course, he looks great. The head here looks a little bit rough, but you know, copies are not always as good as the original. On the human order, Zeus represents justice. He is connected with kings. Kings are the ones who establish justice, and Zeus, you know, is the overseer of justice, you know, throughout the world. His reign helps crops grow, and there is a sense that a bad ruler, that, you know, the rain might stop, the crops are going to fail, things are going to happen to the people as a result of their bad ruler. There was a cult of Zeus in Athens called Zeus Melikios, Zeus the mild one, who has a connection with the underworld, connection to justice, but he's also a god of community welfare. You know, and the fact that he's called Zeus Melikios indicates that he is sort of mild, he's gentle. This is sort of different than the Hesiod Zeus. The Hesiod Zeus is sort of a rough guy. I mean, you don't want to mess with him. He does assure order. He does make alliances, but you do not want to be on that guy's bad side. So he's not so much a kindly figure. Zeus has a bunch of other titles. You know, Zeus of the storms. You know, Zeus Olympius, the Zeus at the cult shrine in Olympia. So there are a bunch of titles of Zeus. This is a plaque. It looks like it might actually be a metope, which is a little plaque between triglyphs on a temple, but it shows a person interacting with this snake. The snake here represents Zeus Melikios, so he's a sort of fertility figure. The snake also indicates the connection with the underworld. And Zeus is also king. He's king of the gods, he's king of men, and in the Homer's Iliad, he is represented as a king who tries to keep balance. Now, there are warring factions among the Olympian gods. Apollo and Artemis and a couple of other gods are on the side of the Trojans, and Hera and Athena and some other gods are on the side of the Greeks. Zeus is largely neutral in the war. Ultimately, Greece is going to win the war. Zeus likes the Trojans better. I mean, he thinks they're I guess he thinks they're better people, but he tries to keep things in balance, right? He's aiming at order. And that's really what a king ideally is supposed to do, right? Maintain the order of his community. So not everything that happens in a kingdom will be to the king's liking, but the king will make sure that things are orderly, that there aren't like rebellions, there aren't other things that cause disorder. Zeus in the Iliad is depicted as a guy with a fair amount of physical strength, and in book 1 of the Iliad, there is a scene on Mount Olympus, which was in the first edition of Maurizio. Sadly, it's been cut in the second. And when we get to the Iliad, I urge you to read the whole first book of the Iliad, because I think it really does. It's worth reading. And there are a bunch of translations out there. So, but at the end of it, Thetis, Achilles' mom, goes to Zeus and begs him to help her son, who's been insulted by Agamemnon. So he wants to get sort of revenge on Agamemnon. Zeus agrees. Hera, of course, who likes the Greeks, is very upset with this idea. She doesn't know exactly what the plan is, but she figures it's going to be bad for the Greeks, and she's upset about that. And then Zeus basically tells her to shut up and sit down, or else. And there's a clear indication that at some time in the past, he did actually beat her up, slap her around, hung her from rafters. It sounds like, maybe whipped her. I mean, it's pretty gruesome. In the Iliad, Zeus, other than that outburst, Zeus doesn't really show violence towards Hera or anyone else. There is this outburst, and there is this indication that Zeus has done something in the past. So I'm not saying it's not troubling, but he is a physically strong. He's stronger than the others. No other individual god could beat him like in a feat of strength. But Zeus, as a king, is constrained by his obligations to other gods in the way that an earthly king is constrained by treaties that he's made with other people. He's constrained by some obligation to his own people. And then within his family, he might be constrained with any obligations that he has with them, all of whom will play some part in the government, right? So, and the thing is, that's not known to humans. So sometimes humans will pray to gods, and then their prayer won't be answered. But it's not because the god didn't hear the prayer, and it's not even because the god isn't sympathetic to the person praying. It's that there's some other obligation. So, for instance, some restrictions on Zeus. In the Iliad, in Book 16, his son, Sarpedon, who is fighting on the side of the Trojans, he's not a Trojan, but he's fighting on the side, he's an ally, and he's fighting on the side of the Trojans. He comes up against Patroclus, who is dressed in Achilles' armor. And Patroclus is destined to be killed by Hector, so he can't die at the hands of Sarpedon. So when they meet, Sarpedon basically has to lose that battle and has to die. Zeus thinks for a moment and is talking with Hera, and he says, I can see that my son is about to die. I could whisk down there, or I could have some messenger god whisk down there and get him off the battlefield, take him back to his home kingdom in Lycia, and he'd be out of the war, and he'd be safe. And Hera says, technically you could do that. You have the ability to do that. But if you do that, all the gods are going to do that, and then you have chaos on your hands. And so Zeus basically watches his son die, does not intervene, lets things play out. He does rescue the son's dead body and gets that whisked back to Lycia, but he does not save his son from death. Now, technically he had the power to do that, but it would really wreak havoc on order. So he feels a bond. There are things binding him, right? There are restrictions on him. Achilles, in the earlier part of Book 16, prays to Zeus and says, I want two things. One, I want Patroclus to win glory when he goes out in my armor. I want him to win glory. Two, I want him to come home safe. And then Homer tells us Zeus granted the first part of the prayer. Patroclus would get glory, but he would die, and he would not return to Achilles. That seems almost like a slap in the face of Achilles, except that Zeus is bound by his obligation to Thetis and to Achilles to get Achilles' glory. What's going to get Achilles' glory is Achilles returning to battle. What's going to get Achilles to return to battle is Patroclus' death. And so he cannot actually help Patroclus. He has to let Patroclus die so that the overall obligation can be dealt with, right? So this is the problem when you're praying to the gods. They may have competing obligations. And humans, of course, don't know anything about that. So, of course, they're likely to see that in the wrong light. Now, neither Hesiod nor Homer are correct about Zeus. What Maurizio means by that statement in this slide is simply that there is no correct. This is not scripture, right? So there is no correct reading. Hesiod's Zeus is a much more rough and ready sort of character, more like the Zeus who threatens Hera. I mean, he's basically like a bare knuckles guy. Homer, for the most part, has a fairly level-headed Zeus who does not get too disturbed by things and tries to maintain order. He every now and then he gets angry, and he makes it clear when you need to toe the line. But he's not the more brutish guy that we get in Hesiod. This is a red figure vase showing Death, Thanatos, and Sleep, Hypnos, and you can see their names next to them. Picking up the body of Sarpedon, the dead body of Sarpedon. Behind them stands Hermes. How do we know? He's got the winged hat. the hat isn't always winged, but he's going to be wearing a hat. He's got the caduceus, the thing that looks like a figure 8 on top of a stick. It's supposed to be 2 intertwined snakes, and he's got the winged sandals. Because of course he's the god who accompanies the dead to the underworld. So these three, of course, they're going to take his body to Lycia for burial, but the soul will go with Hermes to the underworld. There is a little passage in chapter 3 from Aeschylus's play called the Agamemnon. In the play opens with the chorus coming out, and Agamemnon has been away at Troy for 10 years. They are worrying about, how things are sort of going at home, and they're thinking that, if only he would come home and maybe he can put things to right. But there's something that happened in the past that disturbed them. And what happened in the past that disturbs them is that to go to Troy, Agamemnon had to sacrifice, a human sacrifice, his daughter Iphigenia. The gods would not allow winds to blow. The fleet was stuck at a town called Aulis. And the way the play presents it, Agamemnon is bound to avenge the theft of Helen. He has to go to Troy and bring down the Trojans. In a sense, that is his mission from Zeus. But because the gods have got angry with him for some reason, they've stopped the winds, and he can't get there unless he does human sacrifice, and it has to be someone dear to him, so it has to be his daughter. This is something that bothers the chorus a lot. The fact that they're still thinking about it 10 years later is clear this really matters to them. And they figure, but we're human, we just don't know what the whole picture is. Maybe things will still turn out all right. So that's their point. And then they do this choral ode to Zeus. They pray to Zeus. And so we get religious piety here. We also get the story of Iphigenia, the myth, in there as well. One of the things in this little hymn to Zeus is the phrase pathemathos in the Greek, which means learning through suffering, or suffering that get turned into wisdom. And this is a big thing in Greek tragedy. Greek tragedies end badly most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. But the thing is, for the awful thing, usually death, the person learned something. So in the Antigone, Creon, the king of Thebes, who arguably is the real tragic hero in the play, learns something, right? He learns his limitations. So this is a common thing. Oedipus learns who he really is by the end of that play. He also has blinded himself and he's driven into exile. But the point is, he did gain knowledge from it. Right? So this is a common idea for the Greeks. Zeus's gift to humanity, divine violence, but also divine grace. So that through the violence of God, somehow grace comes. And this is what the chorus is hoping for. Through the bloody act of killing Iphigenia, hopefully when Agamemnon comes home, everything will be fine. That was awful, but maybe good things can come of it. Zeus often will take disguises, and he may engage in sexual violence against mortal women. And in a sense, from our perspective in the 21st century, even in the late 20th century, males with power who exert themselves on women who do not have power, there's always a hint of rape or sexual violence there. Think of Harvey Weinstein, the producer. He used his power to coerce women into having sex with him, right? That's sexual violence. And this often happens, right? Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, that was a little more consensual, but still, Bill Clinton's the president. He has power. Monica Lewinsky did not. So that was really sort of an uncomfortable sort of situation. And so Zeus, any sexual relation he would have with a mortal woman is going to be a bit problematic because he, after all, is a god, and you don't really say no to gods. But there are some times when it's actually described and depicted as a rape scene. Now, the story of Leda the mother of Helen of Troy. Leda, who is the wife of Tyndareus, the king of Sparta, Zeus comes to her in the form of a swan. In some versions of the story, their connection is depicted as a seduction scene. That Leda is entirely on board with having sex with Zeus. There are other versions where Zeus clearly is attacking Leda, so it's more of a rape scene. Human beings cannot escape the will of Zeus or their mortality. So when humans interact with the gods, it's always a dicey situation because humans cannot really say no to the gods. I mean, there are a few instances where that happens. One woman so pleased Zeus that Zeus promised her anything, and when asked what she wanted more than anything else, she said, "I want to keep my virginity." And of course, Zeus had already sworn an oath, so he had to go along with it. And he didn't punish her beyond that. I mean, he didn't do anything to her, but that doesn't happen very often. So here we have some pictures of Leda and the swan. The statue on the right clearly shows a more seductive sort of situation. Leda seems to be quite open to the situation. On the little lamp cover, this is the top of a lamp. The wick would come through that hole. Clearly, the bird is attacking, right? Is sort of biting Leda in the neck, and he's egged on by Eros, by Cupid, the little child there with the wings. Hera is the sister and wife of Zeus, who bears only Zeus's offspring. Now, she does have one child on her own in some versions, and that is Hephaestus. So in some versions, Hephaestus is the son of Zeus and Hera. In some, it's just the offspring of Hera. And when that's the case, I think part of the point of Hephaestus being a lame god, a god whose one leg is shorter than the other, so he's lame, he hobbles around, is that whereas Gaia was able to produce monsters like Typhoeus on her own, all Hera can do is produce basically this malformed kid who grows up to be a god with some respect, because he is the god of fire, he is the blacksmith god, he does have some power and some influence, but who somehow still doesn't fit in. But other than that, Hera's other kids are all kids with Zeus, and she has Hebe, the goddess of youth, Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, and Ares, the god of war. Hera is often depicted in Greek myth as angry. She is a nagging wife, and she ultimately is subservient to Zeus, but she really resents it. And this might represent some changeover from pre-Indo-European to post-Indo-European worship. So there are some cult sites of Zeus and Hera where the older images of Zeus and Hera are about the same size, they seem to be about the same weight, and so clearly both gods maybe are seen as equals. But then over time, the Zeus figure gets bigger and the Hera figure gets smaller in those shared sites. That seems to indicate a diminution of Hera from powerful goddess to this henpecked, wife, and really what's her area of control? Primarily marriage, and marriage is all about the control of women. From an ancient perspective, that's really what it's about. Women's sexuality gets controlled in marriage. Because men can have affairs, women, that is frowned on. Hera is the goddess of the city of Argos. She's also the chief goddess, the patron goddess of the city of Corinth, one of the major cities in the Greek world. This was a major port city. So she did have places where she was the number one deity. Now, in those places, my feeling is when people went to the temple, when they went to worship Hera at a festival, they were not worshiping the nagging wife. They were not worshiping that figure, because that figure really is somewhat comic and is somewhat belittled by the fact that she's nagging, right? Powerful women don't need to nag, right? If you're nagging, if you're complaining, if you're yelling, then you've lost control of the situation and you're not really in charge, right? It's a sign of weakness. And so, Hera in Argos and Corinth, she was the top dog in those places. Not that Zeus was ignored, but that she was their patron goddess. She looked out for them, and they figured that she had the power to look out for them. Some think that the name Hera may have some connection with the Greek word heros, which means hero. I'm not so sure about this, but at least that is out there as an idea. So here's a coin from Corinth, I think. Could be from Argos, showing Hera on the coin. Here's a model of the temple. She is also associated with the island of Samos. And there was a ritual there where a figure of Hera was bound to a mast called the Tanai, the binding. And that was connected somehow to marriage ideas, and also to Zeus marrying her. She was the divine consort of Zeus. She's the queen of the gods, but of course, this is a world where the king has the power. The queen is basically his consort, his wife, and she has some privileges in that regard, but she doesn't get to call the shots too much. Although in the Iliad, she does have sort of a side mission sort of going on to help the Greeks through much of the Iliad. So she is able to sort of get stuff done, even despite her position as under Zeus. The peacock is associated with Hera because Hera had a guardian named Argus. Argus had eyes all over his body, and so since he had eyes all over his body, at no time did all the eyes close. So he was always awake. Part of him was always awake. So he was a perfect guardian, a perfect watchman. But when he is killed by Hermes, the eyes on his body get transformed into the peacock. And the cuckoo bird is also associated with Hera and Zeus. There's a story of them transforming into birds. Hera, as noted before, was first worshipped independently of Zeus, probably before the Indo-Europeans came in. And then, of course, as she becomes Zeus's wife, her position shrinks a little bit. And it's possible that the reason Hera in the stories is angry is because anyone would be angry if they once had power and that power was taken away from them. Now, the selection from the Works and Days is from the beginning of the poem. It tells the Prometheus story again, but slightly different. And the main difference in telling is that Pandora here is named. All of the gods are involved in her creation and her development before she gets handed over to Epimetheus. And she is given the jar that contains all the evils. The word in Greek was a jar. It was for a storage jar, not for a box. The guy who translated Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a great scholar, he translated Hesiod into Latin because, at that point, some of the great scholars knew Greek, but a lot of people didn't, and so this was a way to get them familiar. He translated the word that was jar. He used a Latin word that means box. So that's where the box thing comes from. Originally, it was not a box; it was a jar. But jars were used to store grain and oil, as well as wine and other things. So there were lots of things that were put in jars. So it makes some sense. And there are stories. Achilles tells a story in Iliad Book 24 to Priam that at Zeus's throne there were two jars, one of good and one of evils, and he scoops out of each of them into everyone's life. Some get a lot of good stuff and little bad, some get a lot of bad and little good, but everyone gets some mix. And that might even be the origin of Pandora's jar, that Hesiod or one of his predecessors decided instead of there being two jars to be just one jar, and it would be just evils. And so we don't get the good jar at all. But again, you know, Hesiod's sort of pessimistic. Maybe that fits his mindset. We also get after that, so when he finishes the story of Pandora, he then says something along the lines of, if that story doesn't interest you, maybe this will. And then he tells a different story about why life sucks, right? Because that's the sort of the theme of the opening of the Works and Days. Life sucks, and as a result, you have to work your butt off to succeed. And the Works and Days is going to tell you sort of how to do that. It's sort of a farmer's almanac. So the first part is almost like the introduction, and it gives you that information of like, why do we have to bust our butts? It's because of this stuff. So either it's because Pandora had this jar, she opened it, and now life has all these bad things in it, or it's because there have been 5 generations of humans, each generation worse than the one before it, with the last generation, the generation of iron, the age that Hesiod lives in, being the worst of all. But there's still worse to come at some point in the future. So Hesiod has this downward scope. So here we have statue of 3 women. I'm not exactly sure why this slide is even in here. Here we have a relief. It looks like it might have been part of a sarcophagus of Zeus and Hera. Zeus in the front there, and Hera. Very little to absolutely indicate that this is Zeus. He doesn't have the lightning bolt, but there must be other indicators to indicate why this is Zeus and Hera. And here we have Athena. Athena is in the center. You can tell Athena in Greek art. She is wearing a helmet. Women do not wear helmets, so if you get a woman with a helmet on, it's either going to be an Amazon or it's going to be Athena. She is also wearing the aegis. The aegis is this poncho thing that she has over her neck with the snake border. Some artists will show on that the Gorgon's head, Medusa's head, which was affixed to the aegis. Now, Zeus is called the aegis holder, but in art we generally see Athena with the aegis. So the theory in chapter 3 deals with, looks at a selection from a work by Wendy Doniger called The Implied Spider. Wendy Doniger was, well, he still is, a scholar primarily of Hindu and Sanskrit, and she is also a student of Indo-European linguistics. So Indo-European is a language that predates Greek, Latin, German, and also it predates Hittite, and it predates Sanskrit, which is the oldest surviving language we have of the Indo-Europeans is Sanskrit. And in the 19th century, a academic discipline started called comparative grammar, and they looked at Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, and then based on the words and the grammar, they were able to sort of reconstruct what Indo-European would have been like. Now, obviously, it's not going to be smooth because we don't have anything actually composed in Indo-European, but it gives us a rough idea of what Indo-European was like. And the Indo-Europeans, some went into India, some went into Europe, and the ones who went into India, of course, that developed into Sanskrit. So with that background, Doniger sees languages as being a spider's web. And if what we have is the web, right? We've got the Germanic languages and the Italic languages and the Greek languages and the languages that have disappeared, like Gothic and Hittite, and we have Persian, and we've got Sanskrit. All these different branches that form a web. We don't have the spider, which would be Indo-European, but we know the spider had to have been there because we've got the web, right? So that's the idea behind the title of her book. And she argued that myths of all cultures deal with certain themes. Why do we die? What happens to us when we've died? What's involved in growing up? Now, the particular features of that might be quite different from culture to culture. Like for the Norse, if you were a male, the only glorious death, the only thing that would get you, be seen as a true Viking, was if you died in battle. And so, of course, that's going to lead to more fights because, if like you slip on a banana peel and drop dead, that's worthless. Whereas if you die because someone, stabbed you with a sword, woohoo, you get to go to Valhalla. Then obviously you're going to want to get into fights because you're going to want that for yourself, not the other place where you go to hell. So, right, going to Valhalla means dying in battle. Well, the Romans, who were militaristic, not every Roman saw himself as a soldier, and there were Romans who did other things who were valorized. Some of the great poets as well, and those guys had not been soldiers. So different cultures are going to put different emphasis on different things, and so what makes your life worthwhile is going to differ from culture to culture. But all cultures are going to deal with something like, how do we make our life worthwhile? Right? That question is still going to be out here no matter how the different cultures answer it. And Doniger suggests that the thing that probably sparked mythic thinking was the separation of child from mother. So that baby is born, baby is cuddled by mom, is suckled by mom, and this connection goes on for a while, and then gradually the baby is separated from mom, and doesn't have that connection. That connection is now lost, and then stories sort of fill in for that loss. That's her suggestion. I don't know. I haven't read the book. I've only read the selections, so I don't know how she would prove that. But that's her contention. But again, this comes in part from Doniger's background as an Indo-European linguist, seeing the family and then implying something beyond that. And the same thing you can do with stories, that there's a common urge that happens to everyone, and then that comes out in different ways in different cultures. A flood story is the selection. So again, we're getting some from Genesis here. The flood story in Genesis has bits from the Yahwist author and from the Elohist author. At the end of this slide, it says influence of other polytheistic flood stories. The likelihood, this isn't something we can absolutely prove, but the likelihood is there was no flood. No worldwide flood, as gets described in Genesis or some of these other sources. That what happened was some culture, probably the Babylonians, the people who lived in Mesopotamia, between two rivers that flood like the Nile. So there's a seasonal flood. That flood, of course, makes the land around those two rivers very fertile, and therefore you can grow crops, and that can help build a civilization, right? So those river cultures, very important. Floods provide, nutrition. They really help rejuvenate the land when the flood happens, but people also die in the flood, right? So it's sort of this mixed blessing. And the likelihood is that at some point, someone saw that as divinely done, right? That the gods did this for some reason. And maybe they assumed that the gods did it because they were angry. And what would they be angry about? They'd be angry because human beings don't live up to their stated commandments or, codes of behavior, right? They're always messing up. And then eventually a god who is much better would say, screw these guys, that's it, I'm done with these guys. And then would send a flood. And it would be easy to imagine what would that flood be like. It'd be like the floods that we see every year, but it would be so much worse. That would then suggest that the Babylonian culture, which gives us the Epic of Gilgamesh, we also get the Epic of Atrahasis from that same sort of area, that those two are probably closer to the original flood narrative, that the Jewish people figured what's good for them is good for us, so we'll have our flood narrative, but with Yahweh or Elohim, right, with our single God as being the causer of floods. Now, the problem with that is when you've got a single deity causing the flood, then it becomes a bit of a problem on why does someone get rescued. In the polytheistic stuff, one god or maybe a group of gods wants to wipe humanity out, but then some group of gods thinks that's actually a mistake and tries to save at least a few people who can then create the next generation of humans. And that's what you get in the Epic of Gilgamesh and Epic of Atrahasis. Behind those stories, there's one group of gods who wants to destroy, there's another group of gods that wants to preserve. Now, the Greeks did have a flood story. Hesiod seems to know nothing of it, and Homer doesn't seem to know anything about it, but it occurs in later texts, and we have it mainly in the Latin version by Ovid. Involves Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, and Pyrrha was the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, and they are married. At the time of the story, when the flood happens, they are an elderly couple, and when basically humankind is wiped out, they don't know what to do, but Deucalion, of course, is a prophet, and he goes to the shrine of Apollo at Delphi and asks the oracle, what do I do? It's just we two old people, what can we do to bring the earth back? And he is told to throw the bones of your mother over your shoulder. And when he hears this, he thinks, what's that mean? I mean, we're never going to be able to find Mom's grave because the floods washed everything out. And then he thinks about it for a moment and then realizes, well, rocks are Mother Earth's bones. So if we take rocks and throw them over our shoulder, then maybe that will repopulate the earth. And he does that, and it does repopulate the earth. Is the rocks hit the ground, they become human beings. And in Ovid's telling, that's why humans are tough, but why they're also sort of like a bit unfeeling at times, right? So it's a plus and a minus that comes out of them coming from rocks. And even the Greeks had this story because they claimed that the word laos, which means people, came from the Greek word laos, which means stone. Okay, that is a false etymology, but that at any rate was there. So the common thing through all these flood narratives is that some god or group of gods gets upset with humans because they've messed up and wants to start again or wants to just wipe out humankind. As this slide suggests, those flood stories likely originated from an actual fairly big flood of the city of Shuruppak in Sumeria. This would be right where the Tigris and Euphrates come together. And so there might have been an especially bad flood one year that got into folk memory, and then from that got the idea of what happens if it's even worse. And then you get that story. Here is an illustrated manuscript that has Noah's Ark looks almost like a submarine on the water. The Nachleben section here involves poetry, modernist poems, the William Butler Yeats poem Leda and the Swan from 1928, and Hilda Doolittle, who went under the pen name H.D., her poem Leda from 1919. Now, there are two ways you can really depict the Leda and Zeus assignation. Either Zeus forced himself on Leda, or it was more mutual, or it was a seduction, a gentler thing. And Yeats emphasizes the violence of the act and suggests that one of the results, the birth of Helen, leads to the Trojan War, and the violence of Helen's engendering sort of spills over and is what sort of causes the Trojan War. Doolittle, on the other hand, imagines this as a lush experience of just being overcome by the god, right? So this is much more sort of an ecstatic moment for Hilda Doolittle, and for Yeats, it's a much more sort of moralistic and difficult scene. But both poems are quite beautiful. And then finally, we've got this painting by Marie Laurencin of Leda and the Swan. This obviously depicts a scene much more like H.D.'s depiction, right? So you've got her hugging the swan, and the swan sort of drooped over her arm, and she's sort of petting it. So this is clearly not a sort of violent act here. It's at least welcomed by Leda.